By sunrise, the war was supposed to be finished. From the cliffs above the water, the Persian king could see everything that mattered. Hundreds of ships, perfect lines, oars moving in rhythm. The largest navy the world had ever assembled compressed into one narrow stretch of sea. This was not supposed to be a battle. It was supposed to be a formality. Across the strait, there was no empire, no massive fleet, no reassuring symmetry, just a smaller collection of Greek ships packed too tightly together, pinned against their own coastline, with nowhere left to run. If the Persians moved forward, the Greeks would have to fight. If they tried to retreat, they would collide with one another. Either way, this should have ended quickly. That was the assumption. But assumptions are dangerous when they come from height, distance, and certainty. Down on the water, nothing looked orderly. Greek captains could not see the full battlefield. They did not know how many Persian ships were advancing. They could not hear commands beyond the length of a single deck. All they could see were the backs of other ships, the flash of bronze rams, and the narrowing water ahead. This was not a heroic moment. It was claustrophobic, loud, unclear. The sea itself was working against them. The strait was tight, uneven, and unpredictable. Wind shifted without warning. Currents pushed hulls sideways. A ship that lost formation for even a moment risked colliding with its own allies. The Persian navy, by contrast, believed it was in control. They had surrounded the Greeks overnight, cut off every escape route, closed the exits. From a strategic point of view, this was flawless. The Greeks were trapped inside the strait like an animal backed into a corner. But naval battles are not decided on maps. They are decided in seconds, by visibility, by spacing, by whether a helmsman can react before wood meets bronze. As the Persian fleet advanced, something subtle began to go wrong. The front ranks slowed, compressed by the narrow water. Ships behind them continued forward, unaware of the bottleneck forming ahead. Oars tangled, signals became harder to pass. Lines that had looked clean from above began to bend. No alarm sounded, no single mistake stood out. And that was the problem. The Greeks did not charge. They did not rush forward. They waited. Their ships held position longer than expected, bows angled just enough to absorb impact. They allowed the Persian fleet to enter the strait fully, deeper than caution should have allowed. From the cliffs, it still looked like dominance. From the water, it felt like suffocation. Then the first collision happened. Not an attack, an accident. One Persian ship clipped another while trying to adjust course. Oars snapped. Momentum carried both vessels sideways. The ships behind them had no room to stop. In a wide sea, this would have meant nothing. In the strait, it changed everything. Greek ships began moving, not forward, but sideways, pivoting into gaps that shouldn't have existed. Bronze rams struck hulls already off balance. One ship sank, then another, not because it was weaker, but because it had nowhere to go. Confusion spread faster than any orders ever could. The Persian advantage, numbers, had become a liability. Their own ships blocked their movement. Their own formation trapped them inside the space they had chosen. And still, from above, it looked manageable. What the king could not see from the cliffs was that the battle had already passed the point where commands mattered. Once ships could no longer maneuver freely, this was no longer a contest between fleets. It was a collapse unfolding in slow motion. And the Greeks knew it. This was the moment the numbers stopped mattering. This was where the empire's certainty began to crack. The rest of the day would decide more than a battle. It would decide whether this empire could ever impose its will across the sea again. And there was no way to stop what had already started. The Persian commanders did not believe they were walking into danger. From their perspective, everything had gone according to plan. The Greeks were contained. Their fleet was boxed in. The exits were sealed. There would be no retreat, no dispersal, no escape into open water. The narrow strait was supposed to work against the defenders, not the attackers. This belief shaped every decision that followed.
The Persian navy was built for dominance in open seas. Speed, numbers, and flexibility were its strengths. It relied on space, space to maneuver, space to surround, space to overwhelm. Inside the strait, those advantages were assumed to remain intact, simply compressed. That assumption was never questioned. Orders continued to move forward, maintain pressure, advance steadily, keep formation. No single commander felt urgency, because urgency implies risk, and from the Persian viewpoint, risk no longer existed. Below deck, rowers felt the strain first. The waterway narrowed further than expected. Ships ahead slowed, but the command to stop did not arrive in time. Oars dipped into turbulent currents, pulling unevenly. Small corrections became harder to make. Still, no one panicked. Naval battles don't feel dramatic at first. They feel procedural. Commands are repeated. Movements are adjusted. Everyone believes the situation is under control until it isn't. The Greeks, meanwhile, were not improvising. They were executing something far simpler. They understood the water. Their ships were heavier, slower, and less flexible in open seas, but inside the strait, weight became stability. Their hulls absorbed impact better. Their rams hit harder at close range. They were not trying to outmaneuver the Persian fleet. They were trying to deny it movement altogether. So they waited. Persian ships continued to funnel inward. More hulls entered the strait than the space could accommodate. What looked like strength from a distance became congestion up close. Signals between squadrons began to lag. Orders reached some ships too late and others not at all. This was not yet defeat, but it was no longer control. The Greeks chose this moment to move, not with a charge, but with precision. Individual ships pivoted into openings created by Persian hesitation. Rams struck sides that could not turn fast enough to respond. A disabled ship drifted sideways, blocking the path behind it. Another collided while attempting to avoid the wreck. Each incident was minor in isolation. Together, they multiplied. Persian crews began reacting instead of advancing. Ships slowed to avoid collisions. Lines broke. Momentum vanished. The formation that had been meant to overwhelm now worked against itself. This was the critical shift. Once momentum is lost at sea, regaining it inside a confined space is nearly impossible. Greek captains recognized it instantly. They pressed closer, striking not where the enemy was strongest, but where movement had failed. The goal was no longer to sink ships, it was to lock them in place. From above, it still did not look like disaster, but down on the decks, the sound changed. Wood splintering, oars snapping, shouts colliding with one another, stripped of clarity. Crews could no longer tell which orders mattered. The Persian navy was not losing because it was weaker. It was losing because it had entered a space where its advantages could no longer function. By the time commanders realized this, the strait was already full. Ships at the rear continued to push forward, unaware that the front had stalled. Pressure built from every direction. Movement became chaotic. Coordination dissolved. This was no longer a battle between two fleets. It was an empire trying to maneuver inside a space it did not understand. And once that realization set in, there was no clean way out. The collapse had not yet peaked, but it was inevitable now.
The strait did not look dangerous from above. From the cliffs, it appeared calm. Narrow, yes, but manageable. Water moved steadily. No waves. No obvious threat. To an empire used to controlling vast coastlines, this channel of sea seemed insignificant. But for the men inside it, the strait was not a setting. It was an active force. Currents ran unevenly, pulling ships sideways at the worst possible moments. Wind funneled unpredictably between the land masses, catching sails and throwing balance off by degrees that mattered. A ship that drifted even slightly could expose its side, and at this distance, that was enough. Greek captains understood this instinctively. They had sailed these waters for years. They knew where the current tightened, where it released, and where ships struggled to turn. The Persians did not. Their ships were built for speed and flexibility in open water. Inside the strait, that speed worked against them. Faster movement meant less reaction time. Lighter hulls meant less stability on impact. Their advantage turned brittle. The Greeks did not fight the fleet. They fought the space. They held their line just long enough to force the Persians deeper in. Every moment delayed reduced the attackers' ability to maneuver. Once the strait was fully congested, the Greeks moved decisively. Rams struck hulls already drifting. Ships that tried to turn found no room. Those that slowed became obstacles. The water filled with wreckage, not from a single clash, but from accumulated failure. At sea, there is a moment when recovery becomes impossible. This was it. Persian crews began abandoning coordination. Individual captains tried to escape pressure by turning toward open water, but the exits were blocked. Others attempted to push forward only to collide with allies. Commands conflicted, signals vanished in noise. From a strategic standpoint, the Persian navy was still intact. From a physical standpoint, it was immobilized. The Greeks exploited this mercilessly. They did not spread out, they concentrated. Each successful strike created another obstruction. Each obstruction multiplied chaos. The strait narrowed further with every damaged hull. This was no longer about tactics, it was about physics. A ship cannot move if there is no space to move into. The Persians had entered the strait believing numbers would overwhelm resistance. Instead, numbers removed flexibility. The more ships they committed, the worse the situation became. This was the point of no return. Attempts to withdraw failed. Ships at the front could not reverse fast enough. Ships at the rear continued pushing forward, unaware of the collapse ahead. Pressure built until vessels crushed against one another. The Greeks recognized the shift and intensified their attacks, not with speed, but with patience. They struck ships already compromised, already trapped, already unable to respond. The water turned hostile. Floating debris snagged oars, wounded ships drifted into functioning ones. Control disappeared. From the cliffs, it finally began to look wrong. What had once appeared orderly now resembled congestion without pattern. Lines no longer advanced. The Persian fleet was no longer expanding. It was folding inward. And still, the realization came too late. Naval battles cannot be reset. There is no pause, no regrouping once movement is lost. Inside the strait, every second without control made recovery harder. The Greeks were not winning because they were braver. They were winning because they had turned the battlefield itself into an ally. The empire had brought its fleet into a space where power could not be expressed, and the sea enforced that mistake without mercy. By the time the Persian commanders understood what the strait had done to them, the battle was already decided. What remained was not strategy, it was consequence. For a brief moment, the collapse did not look final. Amid the congestion and confusion, parts of the Persian fleet still functioned. Some ships retained spacing. A few squadrons managed to realign, pushing through debris and damaged hulls. From certain angles, especially from above, it appeared as if order was returning. This illusion mattered. Persian commanders seized on it immediately. They issued new signals: regroup, press forward, exploit openings. The belief was simple. If pressure could be re-established, the Greeks, smaller in number, would eventually break. That belief was logical and completely disconnected from reality on the water. The ships that appeared to be advancing were doing so in isolation. They were no longer supported by a coherent formation. Every forward movement created vulnerability on the sides. Every turn exposed hulls already scraped and weakened by earlier collisions. The Greeks recognized the illusion instantly. They did not react emotionally. They did not rush to finish the battle. They did the opposite.
They allowed the Persians to believe recovery was possible. Greek ships pulled back slightly in certain sectors, creating narrow channels that looked like escape routes. Persian captains moved toward them instinctively, desperate for space, for momentum, for air. Those channels closed the moment ships entered them. Rams struck from angles that could not be defended against. Ships that thought they were breaking free instead became new obstructions. Each failed push added wreckage to the strait. This is where naval battles turn irreversible. Once a fleet fractures into independent units, coordination dies. Each captain begins fighting his own battle, blind to the wider situation. Orders lose relevance. Survival replaces strategy. Persian crews were now reacting, not executing. Some attempted to retreat fully, turning toward the open sea. They found the exits blocked by ships that had entered hours earlier and never escaped. Others attempted to push forward through resistance that no longer behaved predictably. The Greeks no longer needed to seek advantage. It was being handed to them. They struck ships that overextended. They disabled helms. They targeted oars instead of hulls, immobilizing vessels rather than sinking them. A floating obstacle was more useful than a wreck under the surface. From above, the scene grew unmistakable. The Persian fleet was no longer expanding outward, it was compressing inward. What had begun as an encirclement had reversed itself. The attackers were now trapped inside their own mass. The king could see movement, but not control. Noise, but not coordination. Ships collided without enemy contact. Fires broke out on decks where crews had lost command. This was not defeat by force alone. It was defeat by exhaustion. Rowers strained against currents they could not overcome. Crews fought fires, leaks, and collisions simultaneously. Communication failed. Morale fractured. And still, the illusion persisted for some. There is always a moment in large defeats where leaders believe recovery is just one command away, one adjustment, one push. That moment had already passed. The Greeks did not celebrate. They did not pause. They maintained pressure methodically, striking where the Persian fleet tried hardest to regain control. Every attempt to recovery created another weakness. By midday, the sea inside the strait was no longer navigable in any strategic sense. It was cluttered, chaotic, and hostile to movement. The Persian fleet had lost not just ships, but the ability to function as a fleet at all. This was the turning point. Not the first collision, not the first sinking, but the moment that the idea of recovery died. From here on, nothing the Persians did could change the outcome. Only the scale of the loss remained undecided.
Once the idea of recovery disappeared, panic followed quietly. Not all at once, not in a wave, but in fragments. A Persian ship would turn toward open water and stop. Another would attempt to reverse and find its stern blocked. A third would drift sideways, pushed by current and wreckage, and collide without warning. Each failure spread awareness faster than any shouted order. There was no longer a direction that promised safety. The exits from the strait had become choke points. Ships that reached them could not pass through quickly enough. Those behind continued pushing forward, compressing the space further. Momentum turned into pressure. Pressure turned into damage. Greek ships pressed in closer now, not recklessly, but decisively. They no longer needed to seek favorable angles. Almost every angle was favorable. Persian vessels could not turn fast enough to present their bows. Rams struck exposed sides repeatedly. Oars shattered. Steering failed. A ship without oars is not just slow, it is helpless. Once immobilized, it became part of the battlefield itself, a floating wall, an obstruction that trapped others. Greek captains exploited this ruthlessly, disabling ships rather than sinking them outright. The water filled with bodies, debris, broken spars, and drifting hulls. Visibility dropped. Crews struggled to distinguish enemy from ally. Commands dissolved into noise. This was no longer combat in any organized sense. It was containment. Persian crews began abandoning ships not because they were sinking, but because they could no longer move. Fires spread unchecked, smoke obscured vision, panic replaced discipline. The Greeks did not pursue fleeing ships far. They did not need to. Most could not flee. The geography completed the work. Currents carried wreckage back into the mass of ships. Wind pushed disabled vessels sideways into functioning ones. Every environmental factor favored congestion, not escape. From the cliffs, the scene was unmistakable now. The fleet was breaking apart. Not retreating, not reorganizing, breaking. Ships turned away from the fight only to collide with others doing the same. The strait had become a trap with no interior order and no exit capacity. The more the Persians tried to escape, the worse the congestion became. This was the cruel mathematics of confined naval warfare. Space cannot be created once it is gone. Greek ships advanced methodically, striking where resistance was weakest, where movement had failed, where panic had taken hold. They did not need speed, they needed patience. By late afternoon, the Persian fleet no longer existed as a coherent force. What remained were isolated ships, clusters of wreckage, and men attempting to survive the water itself. Some vessels escaped the strait eventually, damaged and scattered. Most did not. This was not the annihilation of an army. It was something worse. It was the destruction of naval confidence. The empire had invested heavily in its fleet. It was the foundation of control across the sea, and in one day, inside one narrow passage, that foundation had shattered. The Greeks understood what this meant immediately. This was not just a victory, it was strategic finality. Without control of the sea, the empire could not sustain its campaign. Supplies, movement, coordination, all depended on naval dominance that no longer existed. As the sun lowered, the water calmed. The battle was over not because fighting had stopped, but because there was nothing left to fight with. The strait held the evidence. Broken ships, floating debris, silence where command had once existed, and above it all, the realization that this loss could not be reversed. The empire had entered the strait believing numbers would guarantee victory. It would leave knowing that numbers, in the wrong place, could guarantee collapse. The battle ended quietly. There was no formal withdrawal, no organized retreat, just ships that survived drifting away from the strait, damaged, scattered, and no longer part of a fleet. For the Persian commanders, the first task was not victory or defeat, it was accounting. How many ships remained functional? How many crews could still operate? How many formations could still be assembled? The answers were worse than expected. Losses were not evenly distributed. Entire squadrons were gone. Others had ships but no crews. Some vessels floated but could not move. Repairs were possible, but time was not. Naval power does not recover quickly. Ships require materials, skilled labor, trained crews, and coordination. Even a victorious fleet needs weeks to reorganize after battle. A defeated one needs far longer. And this defeat had occurred deep inside hostile waters, far from secure ports. The Persian navy still existed on paper. In reality, it had lost cohesion. Greek commanders understood this immediately. They did not pursue recklessly. They did not scatter to chase survivors. Their goal had already been achieved. Control of the sea, even temporarily, had shifted. That shift changed everything. Without naval dominance, supply lines were vulnerable. Communication slowed. Large-scale movement became risky. The empire's army on land suddenly depended on routes that could be disrupted, delayed, or cut entirely. This was not a single setback, it was a structural failure. Persian leadership attempted to stabilize the situation. Remaining ships were regrouped where possible, crews were reassigned, orders were issued to maintain presence and project strength. But presence without confidence is hollow. The loss at sea spread uncertainty throughout the campaign. Allies hesitated, neutral states recalculated, the image of invincibility cracked. For the Greeks, the effect was the opposite. They did not gain numerical superiority, they did not suddenly dominate the region. What they gained was belief. Belief that the empire could be resisted, belief that its systems could fail, belief that terrain, preparation, and discipline could outweigh scale. This belief mattered more than ships. Cities that hesitated now committed, resources flowed more freely, cooperation increased. The psychological balance shifted. And psychology, once changed, does not revert easily. The Persian king still commanded vast resources, armies still stood, campaigns could continue, but the strategy that relied on overwhelming force supported by uncontested naval power was finished. The empire could still fight, it could no longer dictate. This distinction defines turning points in history. A power that dictates controls timing, location, and tempo. A power that reacts loses initiative. After the strait, the empire was reacting. Greek forces chose where to stand, when to resist, when to withdraw. The pressure reversed direction. The sea, once a tool of expansion, became a vulnerability. Every future movement required caution, every supply effort needed protection, every plan carried risk that had not existed before. This is why the aftermath mattered more than the battle itself. The defeat could not be undone by bravery or numbers. It required rebuilding trust, cohesion, and dominance, things that cannot be rushed. And time now was working against the empire. As days passed, the consequences widened. What had seemed like a single naval engagement revealed itself as a structural fracture that spread outward, weakening everything it supported. The Greeks had not destroyed an empire in one day, but they had removed the foundation that allowed it to expand without resistance. What followed was inevitable.
The lesson of the strait was not learned slowly. It was absorbed immediately. Across the region, commanders, sailors, and rulers understood what had happened, not as a story of bravery or luck, but as a demonstration of limits. Power, no matter how vast, could be neutralized if forced into the wrong space. The sea was no longer just a highway for empires. It was a battlefield that could reject them. Before this day, naval dominance had been assumed to scale naturally. More ships meant more control. Larger fleets meant inevitable victory. Geography was something to be crossed, not respected. That assumption ended here. The battle proved that control of the sea depended not on size alone, but on compatibility between force and environment. A fleet optimized for open water could be rendered ineffective inside confined spaces. Numbers could become a burden, momentum could become pressure. Future empires took note. Naval doctrine changed quietly, but permanently. Straits, choke points, and narrow seas were no longer treated as transitional zones. They became strategic weapons. Control of movement mattered more than raw strength. The Greeks did not invent this idea. They proved it. From that point forward, successful naval powers planned around restriction as much as expansion. They avoided committing fleets where maneuver was limited. They learned to deny space instead of chasing destruction. The empire that had lost its fleet learned this lesson too late. Its campaigns continued, but without the certainty that had once driven them. Every movement now required calculation. Every coastal operation carried risk. The sea could no longer be assumed friendly. This was the true consequence of the day. Not ships lost, not men drowned, but confidence broken. Empires survive defeats when they believe their systems still work. They fail when those systems are exposed as fragile. The strait exposed fragility. For the Greeks, the victory reshaped identity. They did not suddenly become dominant. They did not gain unlimited resources. What they gained was leverage.
the ability to choose resistance without immediate annihilation. This changed the balance of power permanently. No empire after this battle ignored geography again. No serious naval commander treated confined waters casually. The idea that force alone could impose order died in that narrow passage. The sea had imposed its own rules, and those rules favored discipline, patience, and understanding over scale. This is why the battle mattered long after the wreckage was cleared. It was not remembered because of how many ships were lost, but because of what was proven impossible afterward. The empire would fight on, history would move forward, but the certainty that numbers could solve every problem never returned. The strait remained where it always had been, unchanged, narrow, indifferent. What changed was how power approached it. One day, one space, one decision to force strength where strength could not operate. That was enough. This was not the destruction of an empire in a single battle. It was something more enduring. It was the moment the world learned that power has boundaries, and that ignoring them carries a cost no fleet can absorb. If this kind of moment matters to you, not the myths, not the speeches, but the single decisions that quietly change history, then stay here, because there are more days like this. Battles where numbers failed, where confidence collapsed, where geography, timing, and pressure decided everything before anyone realized it. Subscribe if you want to understand how power actually breaks. And if you think this battle proves that size always loses to intelligence, or that this only worked once, tell me in the comments. The next story depends on what you notice here.